In today's video, we're going to be discussing some of the biggest trades we've ever seen go down at the NHL Draft. And that's coming up next. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. We review and discuss all 31 NHL teams. So if you're a huge hockey fan, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. So as I mentioned off the top, I thought it'd be fun to take a look at some of the biggest trades to ever go down at the NHL entry draft. Now, we've talked a lot on this channel about a lot of NHL trade rumors. We cover all the transactions we've seen go down during the past season. And we've talked a lot about things that we may see go down at the 2018 NHL entry draft coming up here soon in Dallas, Texas later this month. So I thought it'd be fun to go back and take a look at some of the biggest trades to ever go down during the draft weekend. Depending on how closely you follow the draft, some of you may or may not know that some of these deals went down at the draft, and some of you may be too young to remember some of the stuff going down anyhow. So I thought it'd be fun to look back at some of the more recent history of the NHL draft and look at some of the biggest deals that have gone down. Now, there is plenty to pick from, so this is just my opinion. If there's any deals you feel that I left off this list that justify being on it, leave a comment down below and we'll certainly discuss further in the comment section. We may do an updated version of this video maybe in a year or two's time once we've had more trades and more deals go down at this year, possibly next year's draft. So we'll certainly keep everything in mind for what you leave down in the comment section. So let's jump into the trades because we have a lot to discuss and a lot to cover here. Now we're going to start with the 2015 NHL entry draft where the Boston Bruins were incredibly active. New general manager Don Sweeney had only been on the job a short time and was making lots of efforts to change things up and shake up that roster. Now he made a couple of big trades that day. I'm going to kind of lump them into one here as number 10. Now the Boston Bruins trade power forward Milan Lucic to the LA Kings. In return, the Kings sent goaltender Martin Jones, defenseman Colin Miller, as well as a first-round pick back to the Boston Bruins. Now, of course, as you know, Martin Jones didn't stay in Boston very long. He was then in turn traded back over to the San Jose Sharks. So that was just a transitional piece for the Bruins. But still, they unloaded a very top player, Milan Lucic. We also saw the Boston Bruins ship out young defenseman Dougie Hamilton to the Calgary Flames. Now, Hamilton landed them back a first-round pick as well as 2 second-round picks. So they actually got 3 draft picks in return for Dougie Hamilton. So that worked out quite well. In this draft, Boston Bruins ended up having 3 consecutive draft picks in the middle part of the first round. One of those picks ended up being Jake DeBrusk. A couple of the other guys are still prospects in the organization, but DeBrusk is the most prominent amongst the 3, who's currently on the Bruins roster. Number 9, we're going to go back to last year. At the 2016 NHL entry draft, we saw a fairly significant trade between the New York Rangers and the Arizona Coyotes. We saw the New York Rangers send goaltender Antti Ranta and forward Derek Stepan down to the Arizona Coyotes for their first-round pick, as well as Anthony DeAngelo. Now, their first-round pick was then used to select Swedish forward Elias Andersson. Andersson is a top prospect for the Rangers. Andersson is expected to most likely make the roster this coming fall for the 2018-19 NHL season, and looks like he could be an impact player for the Rangers moving forward. For the next trade, we're going to go back to 2012 when the Pittsburgh Penguins were hosting the draft and they made a big splash at that draft weekend. The Penguins ended up trading at the time who was their number 3 center, Jordan Staal, over to the Carolina Hurricanes. In return, they received Carolina's first-round pick, number 8 overall, as well as Brandon Sutter and Brian Dumoulin. Now, they used that pick to select defenseman Derek Pouliot. Now, as we all know, that pick didn't work out very well. Pouliot didn't work out overly well in Pittsburgh, and he was later traded this past season to the Vancouver Canucks. This next deal also involves the Pittsburgh Penguins. We're going to go back to the 2014 NHL Draft, where we saw the Pittsburgh Penguins and Nashville Predators hook up for a trade, which saw the real deal, James Neal, going from the Penguins over to the Predators in return for Patrick Hornqvist. Now, you could argue that probably both teams benefited from this trade. Obviously, Hornqvist has been a huge part of the Penguins, helping them win Stanley Cups since then, and he's re-signed for a long-term deal. So Hornqvist is certainly a big part of that core of players that's allowed the Penguins to be so successful. James Neal certainly had some success in Nashville as well, helping them go to a Cup final against his former team, the Penguins, just last season. But you could probably argue that even though James Neal at the time might have been considered a better player, as he had come off a 40-goal season with the Penguins, you might argue there that the Penguins actually won that deal, as they've overall had more team success since then. Hornqvist has been a big part of that, and James Neal, even though he was successful in Nashville, was exposed in the expansion draft and is now part of the Vegas Golden Knights franchise. Now for this next trade, which is number 6 on our list, we're going to go back to the 2011 NHL Draft weekend. We saw the Philadelphia Flyers make some massive moves that a lot of people did not see coming. They unloaded superstars Jeff Carter and Mike Richards in separate deals here. We're going to lump these kind of together as one since it was the same team kind of making some major moves here. We saw the Philadelphia Flyers send Jeff Carter to the Columbus Blue Jackets in return for the 8th overall pick in the draft, as well as a 3rd round pick and Jake Voracek. I dare say the Flyers cleaned up on that deal. Jeff Carter never really fit in Columbus, was soon traded to the LA Kings not too long after, and look at what they ended up getting out of it. They got Jake Voracek, who's been a tremendous top player for them, putting up a ton of points. They got a 1st round pick, which turned out to be Sean Couturier. That deal worked out quite well for the Flyers, even though a lot of people thought they were crazy for trading one of their top players in Jeff Carter at the time, but it worked out really well. That same day, they also traded another top guy for the Flyers, Mike Richards, who was traded to the LA Kings, but in return, they brought back power forward Wayne Simmons, Braden Shen, and a 2nd round pick. So obviously, I think they did quite well. When you're trading top guys like that, it's really difficult to win the trade. You know, as the old saying goes, the best player, whoever's getting the best player in a trade, wins the trade. But you know, even though at the time it might have looked that way, that the Flyers might have lost those deals long term here, I think they've certainly pulled ahead and did quite nicely in both of those trades. Obviously, they were great players for the Flyers for a long time. There was a lot of other speculation going on about immaturity and partying and all kinds of. They kind of want to shake up the culture in the leadership group and within the team and in the dressing room, and they certainly accomplished that. Now, this next trade we're going to talk about, number 5 on our list, was not too long ago. We're only going back to 2017 NHL Draft, which saw the Chicago Blackhawks kind of shaking things up, trading Russian forward Artemi Panarin to the Columbus Blue Jackets in return, bringing back old-time favorite Brandon Saad to the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, you could argue that right now it looks like Columbus is winning that trade. Panarin put up some fantastic numbers for the Blue Jackets, and Brandon Saad struggled in his return to the Chicago Blackhawks. We all thought Saad being returned with Jonathan Toews might generate a good boost for the Hawks, for Toews and for Saad. But things didn't really work out, but Panarin kept on chugging along in Columbus and put up some good numbers there. So, another big trade with the Blackhawks, and it looks as though the Blue Jackets probably right now would be considered the winner of that trade. Now, the number 4 trade on this list, we're going to go all the way back to the 2001 draft. This trade involves the Ottawa Senators and the New York Islanders. Now, as we all know, the New York Islanders general manager at the time, Mike Milbury, are arguably known as one of the worst GMs in NHL history, made a lot of bad trades, and this certainly ranks up there with them. Obviously, the Ottawa Senators had a lot of issues with star forward Alexei Yashin. Everybody knew that Ottawa would look to deal Alexei Yashin, and they found their trade at the NHL Draft weekend in 2001. They traded Alexei Yashin to the New York Islanders for the number 2 overall pick, which they then used to select Jason Spezza, who was arguably one of their franchise players for many years, put up some fantastic numbers in Ottawa for a long time. They also received forward Bill McCult and a defenseman that wasn't really known well at the time by the name of Zdeno Chara. That's right, Zdeno Chara was involved in this trade. The Senators picked up Jason Spezza and Zdeno Chara in return for Alexei Yashin. Obviously, like I said, Spezza went on to be their top center for a long time. Chara put in some really solid years as well. Unfortunately, they lost him to free agency. The fact that they could fleece the Islanders for Spezza and Chara for Yashin worked out to be quite well for them. Obviously, Yashin did put up some decent numbers in the Islanders organization, but really, for considering what they gave up for this trade, you could argue that never really worked out at all. They ended up giving Yashin a big contract, and it just was a horrible deal for the Islanders overall. Number 3 trade on this list, we're going to go all the way back to 1999. Now, there's no specific players. It was just draft picks involved, but it was quite an orchestra of engineering by then Vancouver Canucks general manager Brian Burke. Brian Burke, obviously at this point, the Canucks had a high 1st round pick, but they ended up maneuvering around so they could get 2 back-to-back picks at the top of the list to draft Henrik and Daniel Sedin and keep them together on the same NHL franchise. Now, the Atlanta Thrashers were involved in this deal, as well as the Tampa Bay Lightning. How this all worked is a little bit complicated, and it actually ended up being 3 separate trades with picks going back and forth here. So Vancouver Canucks start this trade off by trading their 2000 1st round pick along with Brian McCabe to the Chicago Blackhawks for the number 4 overall pick. Then we see Tampa Bay trade their 1st round pick to Vancouver for the number 4 pick and 2 3rd round picks. Then the Vancouver Canucks trade the first overall pick to the Atlanta Thrashers for the number 2 overall pick and a conditional third. And this allows Vancouver to then have the number 2 and the number 3 selections in the draft, which allows them to draft Neal and Henrik Sedin back-to-back. As we all know, they ended up being Canucks for their entire careers and put up some fantastic numbers. Number 2 trade we're going to talk about here, this one goes back a little further than most of the ones we've discussed. We're going back now to 1994, a trade that involved the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Quebec Nordiques. Now, this is a trade that kind of caught a lot of people off guard. Quebec Nordiques trade the 10th overall pick along with Matt Sundin, defenseman Garth Butcher, and forward Todd Warner to the Toronto Maple Leafs in return for the 22nd pick, defenseman Sylvain Lefebvre, prospect Landon Wilson, and then Leaf captain Wendel Clark. Obviously, this was a tremendous deal. I mean, obviously, Clark and Sundin were really, for the most part, you could say it was a straight-up trade. Obviously, there's other parts involved here, but the rest of it kind of offsets each other. But Clark and Sundin being traded back in the 94 draft was, like I said, took a lot of people by surprise and was a very big deal. One of the bigger trades we've seen go down at the NHL Draft over the years. Now, for the top trade going down to NHL Draft, we're going to go back a little bit further than that, back to 1992, which was the big Eric Lindros trade. Now, obviously, the year before, Eric Lindros was drafted number 1 overall by the Quebec Nordiques, even though he made it abundantly clear that if he was selected by the Nordiques, that he would not play for the organization, he would not report and sign a contract to play for the Nordiques. Obviously, this standoff kind of took a long time to get resolved. Ended up being pretty much a full year. The following year at the draft, the Nordiques finally consummated a deal to trade Eric Lindros to the Philadelphia Flyers. Now, this deal gets even more interesting as the Nordiques were discussing this trade with more than just the Flyers. They also had a pretty solid trade offer from the New York Rangers, and both teams thought that they had a deal. Now, it was originally announced that there was a trade to the Flyers, but then the Rangers thought they had a trade as well, and it ended up going to arbitration to a third-party independent arbitrator to determine which trade happened first or which one it was going to be that was more firm, and ended up being the trade to the Flyers. As we all know, Big 88 ended up having a great career in Philadelphia, but it was something that drug on for a long time. We basically went a whole calendar year waiting for the trade to happen, and then it drug on for weeks after, trying to determine which trade it was that was actually going to be the legit one that was going to happen. Now, it was quite a haul here for the Nordiques, getting back in return from the Flyers. They got themselves a nice superstar as well in Peter Forsberg. They also picked up goaltender Ron Hextall. They got a young player at the time with a lot of potential, and Mike Ricci, who had a pretty solid career as well. So the Nordiques, even though they didn't get their star player that they drafted number 1 overall, they got quite a haul of players in return. Peter Forsberg, not too far down the road into the future, once the organization moved to Colorado, helped that team win the Stanley Cup. So overall, I think the Nordiques did pretty well. The Flyers did pretty well. I mean, Lindros was one of the greatest of all time. Unfortunately, his career was cut short due to concussions. It's unfortunate. That hit with Scott Stevens rocked Eric Lindros in the playoffs. Something that was one of the biggest hits of all time and something we'll all remember, obviously. But, Big 88, that Eric Lindros trade was one of the biggest in NHL history. So in my opinion, that was one of the biggest trades, not only in NHL draft history happening at the draft, but one of the biggest ones to go down at any time at all. Obviously, I don't think anybody will ever top the Wayne Gretzky trade as being the biggest trade of all time in the NHL history. But in my opinion, the Lindros deal was the top one to take place at the NHL draft. Now, just before we go here, just a couple quick honorable mentions. There's been a lot of activity in the last few years, which a lot of you might be more familiar with, depending on how long you've been a hockey fan, as I mentioned. For example, in 2016, we saw the Montreal Canadiens pick up Andrew Shaw from the Chicago Blackhawks. We also saw Brian Elliott get traded to the Calgary Flames from the St. Louis Blues. I mean, that was a fairly significant deal in 2016. And in 2015, besides the trades we talked about, we also saw Ottawa trading goalie Robin Lehner and David Legwand to the Buffalo Sabres for a first-round pick that they used to pick up Colin White. We also saw Ryan O'Reilly get traded from Colorado to Buffalo along with Jamie McGinn for Zadorov, Grigorenko, Compher, and a second-round pick. So it's safe to say that the Buffalo Sabres probably won that deal. They get the best player in the deal, and pretty well most of what they've sent off to Colorado didn't really work out to be long-term viable players for them. And we also saw the Oilers get their goaltender. They picked up Cam Talbot from the Rangers for a combination of 3 draft picks back in 2015. Last year as well, we already mentioned the Panarin for Saad trade, but a couple other deals that went down as well. We saw Ryan Reeves get traded from St. Louis to the Pittsburgh Penguins. Last year as well, we also saw the St. Louis Blues trade Eero Laterra in the 27th overall pick to the Flyers for Braden Shen. So that worked out quite well for the St. Louis Blues, getting Shen. And another fairly significant trade, really, which probably could have easily made my list, happened back in 2013. It's something that we've mentioned not too long ago in the last couple of days in the New Jersey Devils season recap video that we made a couple days ago here. We saw the New Jersey Devils acquire goaltender Corey Schneider from the Vancouver Canucks for their first round pick, which turned out to be Bo Horvat. So I think the Canucks did quite well in return. Obviously, the Devils got a solid starting goaltender, and the Canucks got themselves arguably their top center for the future. So that's the deal. Right now, worked out well for both teams. Could we see Corey Schneider get traded again at this year's NHL Draft? It's something that we just talked about a few days ago. So again, as a reminder, in case there's any deals that I didn't mention today that you feel should be on this list, certainly chime in below down in the comment section. Let me know which trades you think should be on this list. And as I mentioned, as the years go by here, at some point in time, we'll do a revised list as things happen at this year and next year's draft. We can kind of update things as which ones are the top deals to ever go down at the NHL Draft. Also, leave a comment down below. What do you expect this year at the 2018 NHL Draft? We've been talking about trade rumors for months. There's a lot of things that did not go down at the trade deadline that could potentially go down at the draft this year. I do expect it to be a very active time. If following the draft, and especially the first round, is something that you typically haven't done in the past, I'd highly recommend you check it out. If you're new to the channel, I hope you consider subscribing. We cover all 31 NHL teams. There's plenty of content here for all hockey fans to enjoy. So if you're new, smash that subscribe button. If you like this video, make sure you hit that like button as well. I'd really appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you very much for watching, everybody. We'll catch you next time.